Hey y'all, we are back again. I guess you could call this our second season. We were back off hiatus, and yeah, welcome to Poli-Side-Eye, where we break down politics for the average Joe, Jamal, and Jen. Now, what's been going on that's really big news? Housing. It's expensive. The rent, it is too damn high. Where do we begin? Like, how did we get in this situation? Is it because of the pandemic, or has this always been like bubbling up into a crisis?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So first, I want to say I'm super excited to be back. It's been what, like 3 or 4 months since we've done an episode. So, yeah, I'm excited.
Right. Please, before we even get started, I forgot. Like, update us on your life. Like, he lives in the Northeast now, y'all. I can visit him like whenever I want. He's like 2 hours away from
Yeah, so as everyone who watches the show knows, I was working on my dissertation, about to defend my dissertation the last time we met. So I've defended my dissertation, I have my degree in hand, and I'm officially Dr. Jared Clemens. So still kind of surreal, it
me.
hasn't sunk in yet, but yeah, so I completed my dissertation, I moved to Philadelphia a couple months ago. So I am doing a research fellowship at Princeton for the year, and then I'll be a professor at Temple here in Philadelphia starting next year. So big things up in store.
He's a doctor, y'all, and he's legal.
Yeah. Okay, so back to housing. So yeah, so the housing situation is there's a kind of a long-term story and a shorter-term story. So housing in the US has always been, or I should say, providing housing to everybody in the US has always been a big political issue. It was especially pronounced during the Great Depression in the 1920s and early 1930s. We had like this widespread homeless population. And coming out of that, one of the ways that the federal government went about addressing it was through home ownership. So after the Great Depression, that's where we started to see more of a movement on what people call the housing question. So there was this explosion in home ownership for a few decades after the Great Depression. So the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s. But as we've talked about in the show, like that had its own share of issues because we know that Black Americans, by and large, were not able to participate or take advantage of that. So housing has created all types of, in some ways, it's created financial security for a number of people because it's an asset that people can rely on. But at the same time, it's also created a ton of inequalities because we've never been able to extend home ownership to everybody. So pretty much the ceiling for home ownership in the United States has always been around the 60% mark. I think it may have gotten up to about 67% in like the early to mid 2000s, but generally we've never been able to get past that. So that means you have almost a third of the population who are not homeowners. So we have like a third of the population that can't become homeowners for a number of reasons, which we can talk about if you want, which means that a number of people have to rely on renting. But with renting, it's a little bit different because you're kind of at the mercy of your landlord, unless you live in a place, in a building that is rent controlled, which means that there are laws on how much your rent can go up within a given span of time. Usually it's a year, but it varies from place to place. But if you don't have that, then you're just pretty much left at the whim of your landlord. So if they said that they wanted to raise your rent by, I don't know, $400 within one period, like legally they can do that.
Can I ask, what's the percentage of renters and homeowners in the United States? Do you know that information?
Yeah, so on the national level, about 65% of people own their homes, approximately. It ebbs and flows, but around, let's say 60%, give or take. So that means the rest of us, if you're housed, that is, because we have a number of people who are homeless. But if you don't own your home, the remaining people are renters. So it's about a 65-35, 60-40 split. It ebbs and flows, but generally about that.
I feel like in our generation, like I feel like more people are renting, or I might be in a Twitter bubble, but it just feels like the percentage of renting is going up.
So that 65-35 breakdown is a national average. So in certain places, so let's say in suburban areas, more people own their homes, whereas in really dense urban areas, so thinking about your New Yorks, your San Franciscos, your DCs, those types of places, you have a much larger rental population. So in New York, I think it might be almost the reverse. So I think closer to about 60% of people rent versus own. And we can talk about why that is. But by and large, more people own their homes than do rent. Although that's changing, and we can talk about why that might be. So let me backtrack a little bit. So I think it's important to really think about what housing is. So on one hand, like at the very basic level, like we know what a house is. It's like a place you can go out of the elements, as a place of essentially refuge from the outside world, so to speak. But it's not only that. It's also, as I kind of already alluded to, for a number of people, it's an asset. So it's a way of financial security. So the idea being that people can eventually own their home after paying a mortgage on it, which is essentially just a loan that people receive to finance the home. And then after they satisfy those requirements, then the home is theirs, which comes in handy when you're older and you want to retire. So, if you are 70 years old, and want to retire, then you can't also be paying all this money on housing. So home ownership was essentially a way for people to have some form of social and economic security. Now that's one function. Now the last function, and this is a really important component because this is really something we've seen over the last, let's say, 3 or 4 decades, is it's increasingly housing it's become an investment vehicle for a number of people. So now people buy property not to live in it, but they buy it as a way to accrue more wealth. So that can take a number of different forms. Some people will buy a property and rent it out. Some people will buy a property, maybe fix it up, spruce it up a little bit, and then sell it ostensibly for more than they paid for it so they can make a profit. But either way, you are essentially going into a situation where there's already a shortage of the number of homes available at any given time. So if you have these 3 competing interests, you have home ownership as just a place to live, home ownership as a personal asset, and home ownership as an investment vehicle, you can see how it becomes really hard to absorb all of these things into one space. And so what ends up happening is that generally the people who have the most resources, the people who have the most power are the ones who get to dictate really how the housing market functions. And of course, those are going to be the people in the latter camp, the people who have the money to do the investing and so forth. So that's why we're seeing this issue of not only a housing shortage, which is pronounced pretty much everywhere, but also for the housing that they do have, it's being used as more so an investment vehicle than it is as a place to actually house people at a reasonable cost.
Right. And I remember we were talking about this privately, about house flipping and how you hate it. And it looks like something very lucrative. Like you go into a neighborhood, you see like a tear down house and you fix it up, get you a couple $100,000. That seems like a really good deal. What could be wrong with that?
It depends who you ask. So the person doing that, let's say the person doing the flipping in hopes of making a profit from it, it's good for them. Usually people do this in markets where housing values are generally going up as it is. So it's a pretty lucrative business venture. But think about it this way. So I was reading the other day that Atlanta is one of the hot spots for this kind of activity. And where a lot of it is going on are in parts of the city that are relatively poor. So they're not doing this really in Midtown or Buckhead, for the people familiar with Atlanta. They're doing this in areas where investors can buy really cheap property and then spruce it up and then charge, let's say, double what they paid for it. And so for them, it's a great investment. But in these areas, usually the people who live in those communities are not the people who can afford to buy one of these new, let's say, homes that have been flipped. And so what happens to the people if the housing stock in those areas are increasingly out of reach for them? Well, you kind of have one or two options. You can either move, but that's not usually viable for a lot of people because, as we know, housing costs are going up. So if you move, that means you're probably more times than not going to end up paying significantly more than what you're already paying. And if you're moving because you already can't pay what you're paying, then what makes you think that you're going to be able to find a place that is more affordable? Like, the odds are you aren't. So then you end up with a situation where you have growing homelessness. So in a place like, let's say, New York, like we see all of these high-rise constructions everywhere. And at the same time, we also see growing homelessness. So for some people, it's really, really good for the investors. But for most of the people in the country who don't have the money to do that, like they're really harmed by essentially what you're doing is you're reducing the housing supply, the affordable housing supply, even more than it already is. And so the people who can't afford to partake in this whole like speculative activity ultimately end up shit out of luck.
So why aren't these cities doing something about like the housing costs going up?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I was reading an article recently talking about New York City politics, and there are some people in the assembly, which is like the local governing body for New York, who have essentially called out what I just talked about. So calling out the fact that housing is being used as like a speculative enterprise instead of focusing on making sure that people have a place to live, that they don't have to spend 50, 60, 70% of their income in rent. But the issue is that cities depend so much on property tax revenue to fund the daily, pretty much to fund how the city operates every day. So if you think about schools, if you think about, in a lot of places, roads or just general infrastructure, plumbing, like stuff that we don't even think about, like that's all being funded most of the time through property tax revenue. So what do cities do to get that money? Well, they try to engage in ways to raise the property values across the city, because the higher the property value is, the more taxes you can get from it. Because I mean, it makes sense. Like if the tax rate is 5%, you get more money. Let's say a higher yield from 5% on, let's say, a $300,000 property than you would on, let's say, $100,000 property. So cities have incentive to like let the values of these properties go up and up, because that's more tax dollars. Also thinking about homeowners, they have a vested interest in allowing property values to raise as well, because again, it's an asset. So if you are purchasing this asset, you want the asset to appreciate. You want it to be worth more, let's say 20 or 30 years down the line than it was when you bought it. Like that's kind of the whole point of like buying a home. Like if you bought the home and you would lose value from it, then it really wouldn't be a worthwhile investment. So homeowners have an interest in making sure that the property values go up. Renters are hurt the most by rising property values. So you can immediately see there's like these competing interests. So now the question that becomes like, is there a way to get, let's say, homeowners and renters kind of in the same camp so that they don't have like those competing interests? And I think in a lot of places they're trying to figure out ways to not make their interests in conflict with one another. But it's just really hard because, again, there's that third party, these investors who are coming in and really, as I said before, really dictating the terms of the market.
I feel like we're just poor people in like a rich man's game.
I mean, that's pretty much what the stock market is. It's a stock market, real estate investment, all that shit is just, it's a place for rich people to like make money, but without producing anything. So that's the gag of it all. Nothing is being produced. So people are becoming more and more wealthy without giving back anything to the good of the society. Right. So it would be one thing if you were, I don't know, like some business person who comes up with a new technology that can improve people's lives in some meaningful way. But that's not what's going on. People are taking the wealth that they're getting from essentially investment speculations, and then taking that and like just trying to flip it on the stock market or through real estate investments and stuff. There's no production going on. So we're not producing things that people need, that people have to survive. It's just a way for people to make more and more money. People being the very rich people, because only like the top like 12% of people do any form of investment, maybe about 20-25% if you include like retirement investment. But by and large, like most of us do not have any stake in this.
The only investing I'm doing is probably in the casino. The whole thing. The housing costs just going up, rent costs, and then wages, they just stay right here. Like wages will not go up. And it's probably a different topic, but do those two topics go hand in hand sometimes?
Yeah, no, it does actually. So we should do an episode on inflation because that's what you're kind of alluding to. So the Federal Reserve, which people probably hear, I'm like, well, I don't know what the fuck they do. They're just some like white people in this room doing what white people do. But the Federal Reserve is a really powerful institution. And it's one that I've been trying to like explain what they do in a clear way because it's really hard to understand if you don't kind of take your time and dig through what's going on. So what's really going on in thinking about wages, so cost of everything going up, but wages are not. So there's kind of two things going on. One is wages are actually going up slightly, not much, slightly, but they're not going up as fast as the price of pretty much everything else is going up. So food is going up, both groceries, and if you go to a restaurant, you're paying more for an entree. The same entree that you bought a year ago is probably $2 more or something like that. Gas is now starting to come down a little bit, but I mean, actually moderately. But housing still through the roof. And so what ends up happening is that, yeah, sure, like your wages might go up a little bit, but it's not keeping up with price inflation. Now, the Federal Reserve likes this. They actually think this is a good thing. And the reason is because they believe that part of the reason we have inflation is because people have too much money. They have too much money to spend on too few goods. So they'll say that we have all these supply chain issues. And the reason we end up with inflation is because too many of y'all folks got too much money to blow. And so we need to do something about that.
Who has too much money?
Y'all still living off y'all stimmies, essentially, is what the Federal Reserve is saying. I'm not kidding. You can go to the Federal Reserve has to post all of their transcripts of every hearing, every meeting they have. This is all they're very open about this. It's not a secret. But their idea is that, well, the way we can do something about the inflation is by what they call getting wages down. So really creating a recession. So their idea is that if we can have more and more people who are unemployed and or don't have the type of income to purchase all of these goods, then demand for the goods will come down. So there'll be less demand to meet the low supply. So the way that they're trying to combat inflation is by essentially taking more money out of our pockets so we don't have more money to spend on what they view as scarce goods. Now, one might say, well, why do you have to take it out on us? Like, why can't y'all do something for like the corporations who keep raising the prices and whose profits have until recently really been at historical highs? Well, to your point, it's because our country is run by a bunch of rich people and they function or they operate based on their interests. And so they're not going to take it the lumps. Like they're going to pass it on to the people who have the least amount of power in this country, which is usually like working people. And so, oh, okay, what are working people doing about that? Well, now we're seeing everywhere that there have been all of these union organizing efforts to get big companies to raise wages. Like we saw there was a railroad strike last week that was only averted the last minute. Starbucks workers have been organizing everywhere, Trader Joe's, like you name it, like all of these different companies are workers within these companies are organizing because they're seeing what's going on. They're seeing how they're the ones who are having to hold the can for what all of these rich people are doing. And so that's kind of, you put your finger really on what's going on, which is that the imbalance between wages and prices is really falling on working people, not the rich folks.
That is very insightful. I did not know that. Where do you see this problem going in 5 years? And is there a solution for it? What is your solution for it?
I don't have like a silver bullet answer. I mean, I think the unionization stuff is helpful because, workers have to have some way of protecting themselves against getting fucked by their employers, which if they don't, like their employers are going to fuck them. They're already doing that. So I think that's helpful. I think that's useful. The United States we don't learn about it in school because like they don't want you to know this, but the United States has long had a very animated labor history dating all the way back to like the mid to late 19th century. And people have long understood what I just said, which is that when it comes to a question of like who's going to have to pay the price between employees and employers, generally ends up being the employees, because the employers, as I already said, pretty much dictate the terms of the debate. They dictate the terms of how policy is formed, how it's instituted, and all of that. But I think with all of the unionization, you're seeing people recognize that. And so workers have an immense amount of power. Just think about it. You go to the airport, you see all of these people, most of the people in the airport are not unionized. But imagine if everybody who worked at the airport, all of the TSA agents, all of the people who work in the restaurant joints, all of everybody just decided collectively to like strike, to like not come to work. What would that do to the US, not only the US economy, but the global economy? That's how much power they have. And I think people are starting, workers that is, are starting to recognize the type of power they have. And now they're trying to do something about it. And they're essentially saying to their employers, like, look, like if y'all don't do something, if y'all don't stop like shafting us, like we're gonna figure out a way to hurt you, which is gonna be through your pockets, because that's all y'all understand. So I think that's inspiring. But there's gonna have to be some bigger questions about housing and just what it is, and this kind of taken for granted idea that the whole purpose of housing is to be an investment vehicle, in my view, has to be challenged. It's so common sense now, but housing has to first and foremost be a place for people to live. Like that can't take a backseat to anything else. And right now it is. And I don't really blame cities, because cities are kind of, their hands are kind of tied, because the federal government over the last 50 years or so has cut back on the amount of federal money going to cities. So cities are cash strapped, especially post-COVID. Or, I mean, I say post-COVID since people jumped on Biden for saying COVID's over. I meant to say, especially since COVID has emerged. And so they have to rely on like property tax revenue. So again, they are kind of caught between a rock and a hard place. So really what we need is at the federal level to rethink about like what housing is in America. And if private enterprises aren't going to do something about it, which they're not, because all they care about is making money, then it's going to be incumbent upon the government to do something about it. And it's not like this is reinventing the wheel. Like we've had public housing before. Now, what ends up happening is there was once upon a time where we had a decent amount of public housing and people spent a very small sliver of their income on said public housing. But what ends up happening? Well, private real estate engages in this vast propaganda campaign to get people to associate public housing with Black folks. So that's why we just call it the project. So that was one piece. And the second was to advance a very aggressive home ownership campaign to get people to believe that there's something somehow naturally great about being a homeowner, as though just owning your home makes you a better person. But we're all kind of conditioned.
People have that mindset.
Right.
You will get shamed, like, oh, you still rent?
Exactly.
In your late 30s?
Exactly. And there was a concerted effort to instill that belief in people. So even to this day, we celebrate home ownership, but look down upon renting. So these are things that are going to take time to kind of beat out of people, because we're so systematically socialized to think of home ownership as being virtuous. And so I would say the short-term goal—
that is such a word. Can you just repeat that?
We need to break out of thinking of home ownership as virtuous. Like there's nothing virtuous about owning your home. Like you own a home. Okay, great. You want a cookie? Like, but we've been socialized to think that way. So I think we need to break out of that and stop treating it as making you better than anybody else. But that's the more long-term project.
Well, I guess we have to put a pin on it there. I've missed these conversations. It's all connected, it feels like. In today's episode, we're being scammed by the United States of America.
I mean, pretty much. That's a constant theme, honestly.
It feels like a fucking rat race sometimes.
It is.
I see what Garfield was talking about when I was reading the comics at like 6, 7 years old.
Garfield was so ahead of its time. Like, I love Garfield.
It was. And I don't know what I did with all of my like comic books. I had a whole box. Like I bought them all.
Wow. Did you like the cartoon though? I wasn't a huge fan of the cartoon.
I love the cartoon though too. Come on and come to a place where fun never ends. Look, oh wait, let me show you. I
Oh,
bought this shirt too because I'm a geek.
oh, I love it.
I'm a creature of nostalgia. I just am. So, what is the book recommendation for today's episode? If you're new to Poli-Side-Eye, we always do a book recommendation at the end of the show.
So for this week, I'm going to do something slightly different. I'm still going to recommend reading, but I'm not going to do a book. I'm going to do a slightly shameless plug. So I, over the summer, was one of the reporters for this online magazine called The Forum, and it covers issues pertaining to racial inequality. But for the issue, I focused specifically on what the Federal Reserve was doing to attack inflation. So I talked about why everybody, especially people who want to do something about racial inequality, should be concerned. And so I talk about pretty much everything we talked about today. So I talk about how the Federal Reserve wants to suppress wages, how what they're doing is exacerbating housing inflation, why I don't think any of what they're doing is going to do anything to actually combat inflation, and ultimately why the Federal Reserve is just a vehicle for class warfare. So I talk about all of those things online. We can post a link so people can go to the page. I wrote like 5 pieces over the summer, covering pretty much all the policy interventions that, well, not necessarily policy, but all of the actions that the Federal Reserve has taken over the summer. It's pretty wild, actually.
What do you not do?
I do
What do
too.
you not do well? What should I ask? But yes, y'all, the article will be at the bottom underneath the description below. Please check out his article. Is there a title to the article?
Well, it's a collection of articles. So I'll just send you the page that lists all. There's one page and it just lists everything I've written over the summer so people can read what they want.
Okay, cool. And also let the people know where they can find you, social media.
Yeah, I'm still on Twitter, JAYC Tiger Fan. Also on Instagram, same handle.
What I love about your Twitter is you don't get involved into the mess. Like you actually like put in thoughtful like posts concerning like the state of our nation while other people are arguing about Nicki Minaj and Beyonce.
Listen, I know my lane. I'll leave that lane to other people. I just do my thing.
I'm gonna stick to the mess, but please, thank you as always for coming on. We will see y'all. I'm gonna try to do this twice a month or at least once. And also, he might make an appearance on my Patreon, hopefully. And yeah,
I'd love to participate.
oh, great. With that, y'all, make sure y'all like, comment, and subscribe. And I will see y'all. Well, we will see y'all for the next episode. Bye.